Well, most people are aware of Stonehenge and its connotations and things that we found out over time and thought we knew everything, and then lo and behold, all this archaeoastronomy comes in and things like that that connects with ancient cultures. And I've done a recent video about Woodhenge and its connective ideas too. And now there's something very much like that that's here that's known as Seahenge. And so let's talk about it and its connections and differences in reality of it. Seahenge, a subaquatic monument of the European Bronze Age. Today, the United Kingdom is crisscrossed with many fascinating monuments from ancient times, from the ages when these islands were inhabited by different peoples and cultures and tribes of ancient Europe that we talked about a lot, who shared many intriguing beliefs and lived in a great symbiosis with the nature around them. And we talked about elves and the ancient connections and where that mythology kind of derives out of, and the pixies and the Picts and all of that, and its connections, and how they were so much more nature oriented. But from the passage tombs and burial mounds to megaliths to iconic Stonehenge and now Seahenge, these remnants for a time long gone are still an important connection with the lives of all of our ancestors, or of the Caucasian Europeans. They are the fiber that bonds the past and the present, a real passageway that leads us back through time. We're going to talk about passageways. You talk about fiber that binds these people. Well, last year I did a series of videos about sacred trees and tree worship, things more than just the druids and so on, connectives, and how it goes through Egypt and yew trees, how a lot of the statues were made out of yew trees or sycamores, and how those are sacred, how yew trees have connections to the elves, and how even the folklore said that they sprout up where an elf had been buried. I won't go into more folklore about it just yet. Let's continue. One such discovery defied all odds and survived the tireless beating and passages of time for several thousand years. This discovery is so exceptional because of the fact it's not made of stone but of wood. Today we're bringing you the story of one of UK's most mysterious and ancient monuments, the so-called Seahenge. Join us as we pierce the veil of time to discover the true purpose of this fascinating wood ring. The origins of Stonehenge and its discovery. The small, picturesque village of Holme next to the sea is situated in the English county of Norfolk, nestled right up on the coast. On a first glance, it's just like all Norfolk hamlets, cozy and snug, captivating with its rural and simple charms. It is a seaside village that perfectly captures the nature and wildlife which is found in England's marshes in the North Sea. But a remarkable discovery in 1998 woke this hamlet up from its lull and sent waves through the English and global archaeological community. You see, because there's just rolling hills here leading down to dunes, much like a links golf course leading into a beach that just goes on an incredible amount. I don't know if you can quite detect it in the picture that you see here, but the sand can be seen out hundreds of yards into the sea until it gets darker. Well, if we were to flip around to the right, there's an island that's out there, and people have detected a long time ago that basically there was just a river that used to run through this, and the start of the ocean was way out there, and that there's an escarpment that comes up here just a little, and then it does it again right at this ancient site. And so it was put there pretty much for a reason, because you can see this all getting soggy. It also has a connections to bogs and things like that that we've talked a lot about. So let's get into that, because these marshes, moors, bogs. Old Hunstanton Beach, where Seahenge was found, was where that is, and that's at low tide. At high tide, it's all the way solid up here where you saw some moisture at. And at low tide, it recedes back out to that point. But let's just say that a few thousand years ago, the water line was out there at high tide and it barely reached in. It didn't come up to this point. No storm really came up to this point long ago. So when they talk about global warming and well, there's about 4,000 years worth of the seas creeping in, and it crept up about a few feet here, and because it's such a long slope out, it has submerged a lot of land. Like Doggerland, in a lot of places that are under 400 foot of water at the glass global maximum would have been totally exposed. So much archaeology is pretty much lost to time and the waves of that too, like Atlantis. In the early spring of 1998, an amateur archaeologist named John Lorimer was casually catching shrimps on the beach near home with his brother-in-law. The North Seafolk beaches have a distinct look, and a low tide can give a chance to spot some interesting things, and that is exactly what happened to Mr. Lorimer, because it wasn't a shrimp that he found, but a Bronze Age axe head. It was the second such axe head found on that beach within a time frame of just a few months, and Lorimer recognized the fact that it was not by mere chance that it happened, especially because of the other previous find. So he kept returning to Home Beach in the hopes of further discoveries, combing the beach, but what he eventually found was thoroughly unexpected. Emerging from the wave-washed sand was an upturned tree stump. Yeah, basically a tree, a giant tree that had been uprooted entirely with its roots and then chopped off and shoved upside down into a giant hole and set in that manner, upside down. The first guess was that a logical one, I guess, an Anglo-Saxon fish trap, perhaps, which were not unusual around the area, but as tide receded, more and more details began emerging from that sand. What was astonishing and quite unique is a circle of timber posts with a huge upturned stump in the center. The importance was quickly recognized, and professionals were soon at the scene. This unique Bronze Age monument. What was the true purpose of the timber circle? Who erected it? Well, researchers confirmed that the so-called Seahenge was definitely old. In fact, really, really old. The wood chip they took from it dated to the Bronze Age, and it was erected roughly around 2049 BC. With accurate research and dating of wood samples, scientists could pinpoint 2049 BC as the date when the trees had actually been cut down, all seemingly in the same season. And here we see another picture and effigy of it. And so what this is a huge stump in the middle of it, turned upwards to where the roots would normally be like this. And they took it and turned it up like this, and it's flayed open, and there's a place like my palm that's in the center of this. That picture here, though, is after some of the wood and timber had been removed by archaeologists, because if you see a look in the other picture, there was a piece that was right over here that was sitting there, and I believe that was one that was mobile, and the other ones are all submerged and dug into the ground so much and everything that's like, okay, you can take a flick off this one, and here's a piece that's hanging on here, and hell, why don't we take this whole log? But that caused some problems. The wooden circle consists of 55 split oak trunks, which were carefully arranged in a circle and measured around 7 by 6 meters or 23 by 20 foot. The trunks were split in half vertically and arranged so the ground side with the bark, or the rounded side with the bark, was facing outwards and the flat side is inwards, with only a single trunk being placed the opposite way out of those circle. The reason for this is unknown, and it was most likely done with a purpose. Well, we get into that in a second here, but these trunks were split in half vertically. These giant stumps, after they were chopped down, were cut in half, right? All the way up its length. No one knows how tall these things are, but folklore crap says that they were like 30 foot tall or more, the ring of posts. So it's really looked like a towery kind of situation and not really something that looks like just a ring of stones that are smaller and so on. No, it didn't have crossbars and this, that, and the other. In fact, there are very little gap between each one of them that's available. And that was done for a reason somewhat too, it seems like. We'll get into this deeper. Once they reveal it, I'll go deeper. It was deduced that only one of these trunks allowed an entrance into the circle. As it had narrow passages in the form of a Y-shaped fork, allowing an entrance, much like Woodhenge we talked about. In front of this opening stood another trunk, which inhibited people from peering into the circular enclosure. In other words, there was just like a blocker sitting right out there. If there was a doorway, then they had something set out in front of the doorway. There's a blocker, and there's no direct connection. Of course, priests and everything were allowed to do these things, and sacred rites are done, but you don't just go messing around and things with sacred sites and so on. It was deduced that only one of these trunks allowed an entrance into the circle, as it had a narrow passage in the form of Y, as they're saying. Since the timber survived a great length of time, they had eroded greatly, and it is not known how tall they originally were. Inside the circle was an iconic stump, turned upside down with its branching roots pointing upwards. We've talked about Yggdrasil and the world tree and how it works with that in the roots and the underworld and the concept of rebirth. And so you can see a death dais being put up using this exact iconography with these exact form of trees, and it would fit perfectly with the idea that we talked about there, but also in other videos much earlier, where bodies were put up in basically a sky burial or a dais type of thing, and the birds would peck them away and take them up into heaven. And this goes way back in Cro-Magnon times. We've talked about this quite a bit. But there were other people too that also would burn their burials, and not on something like this, but quite often stone or so on, and cremate them. These were the people that brought you that ashes to ashes, dust to dust situation. Let's continue. Ancient beliefs. What was the purpose of Seahenge? Well, but what about the purpose of this wooden enclosure? God, I can't talk. Coffee, please. Since its discovery, Seahenge baffled scientists and gave rise to many theories, all of them quite possible. One thing is certain, its ritual purposes. Several scholars agree that Seahenge was directly related to the burial practices in Bronze Age Britain. And I say yes, and related to a lot of other burial practices that happened. For we've talked about different types of burials. It's a little bit morbid that people were going on to, but until each civilization started to flourish and their own little thing formed out of it, pretty much everybody had this, or a large portion of people had this ideal of burying the people on the left-hand side, Caucasians, and covering them with red ochre facing to the east and so on. That leads all the way into earliest of Egypt and the Levant area and all kinds of sites across Europe. They found a lot of people don't make that connective, but it's like, there it is again. Well, then this king does this, and then yeah, there's different things that start to form out of that. Also later you find that thing that you found way over there in the east looks extremely like this thing right there. We talked about Archeum and its connectives and how it's on the same longitude as Stonehenge and that wood hinge, and it's the farthest reach of the moon on its up and down float as it crisscrosses around the earth and spins like a tetherball. And there's a reason it, and they knew it through archaeoastronomy, but they had been studying since, well, if you go with the beliefs, 200,000 years or more. So here we're seeing little inset pictures of Stonehenge and Woodhenge there, or Seahenge because it's being taken by the sea to note its difference. And it is a little different. But also this upturned roots would be where you would place a body on a dais and let the birds take it away. And people that were connected with the sea also had this connective. There's another group of people who took some of their dead and they would put them in a boat type apparatus and set it on fire. And apparently they put nice stuff with them and everything too, but then they would set them on fire and send them out. There are a lot of ancient stories about that, or that they would send it out and then they would shoot firing arrows into it and then that would catch it on fire. People are probably pretty aware of this fact. It's purported that the enclosure was used for excarnation. It was an ancient funerary practice where the flesh was removed from the body, similar to the modern Tibetan sky burial tradition that still carries on from the ancients, that we talked about 2.5 years ago now. Oh, it's got to be over 3, really. Seemingly, the deceased were placed on top of the upturned stump where they were left exposed to the weather and birds of prey. Ding! Ancient natives of Britain might have believed in the spirit continuing to live beyond the disappearance of the flesh up into heaven, where the birds go, and return to nature. All around them was possible with the mortal remains consumed by the birds' prey and scattered. Now, in other beliefs connected exactly to this situation, in Horus and the birds, you see it in Egypt, but they know the sun goes around and it comes back up again, and tomorrow again the sun will rise. And so that is a resurrection every day that's happening to them, and they equate it all through that in their burials in the same situation as these people, because where they're sending their boats off to? Well, off to the underworld, and see the sea get shiny, and you can see the stars on the sea, and it becomes a sea, and that boat ends up going up into the sky and riding across. And a lot of things we talked about, like the Nebra star disk and all of this, of course, ancient Egypt's belief and how this happens, the Gilgamesh tale and how it's written in the sky right in the place where we're talking about, and all connectives that go on to this idea of belief systems that actually come from an archaic belief system when people were more in harmony with everything, and all the people were, before the giant cities were built and stuff. And there are laments about this situation. But that's where the tree comes into it, and the bird comes into it, and the snake. Eventually it's a different set, and I probably shouldn't even veer off here right now. Go back to the bird and the tree, and a partridge in a pear tree, and a fruit tree. All these ancient people had winged humanoids. You can find it all across. It's not something that's unique in any way. In fact, far from it. Scholars believe that excarnation was the most often practiced for women and children, as there is great disparage of archaeological excavated Bronze Age skeletons where male remains are much more common than those of females and children. Males would get buried, but apparently the females and children would go through other processes. Cremation, this bird ritual, putting in boats and taking it out, things like that, so there's less of it. Even in cultures where a man would be buried, not so necessarily so. We find that same situation in the ancient East also, but there were Amazon women and all these things then that hook up with it, and you can even find women warriors with all these things and hooked up to it, and it's a verifier of ancient mythology. And it keeps happening, a whole bunch of it. Another possible role of Seahenge was ceremonial. There's a great symbolism in the layout of this wooden circle. Some think that it symbolized a boundary between life and death, ding, between the mortal world and the one beyond. As it's placed close to the sea, it is believed that Bronze Age people thought the sea was the world's edge, and with the realm of the dead lying beyond their shores and far in the distant horizons. Ideas like this supposedly kept us from going to the New World, but it also let us know, when we figured out how big the world is and how much was encompassed of it, that there's something on the other side. Everybody says the world was flat. No. They knew it was round long before. 360 degrees, the Sumerians, the whole thing. We've talked about it very much in depth. They knew the size of the earth to accurate measurements. It took real modern 20th, 19th, 20th century technology to really verify that they were off by just a little bit, but it's because the Earth's a little bit pear-shaped, more than they stated. But this insight that you can get from places like this show connections. And that's what I do in a lot of my videos, are types of connections. Well, you start to find culture connections through it all, and things and stuff you see in Conan the Barbarian and putting up on Odysseus and then burning them. And you see it in Star Wars, and you see it in things like that, and it just starts to stand out. Still, we cannot know the answer for sure, as time has certainly washed away the original purpose of Stonehenge. However, it's easy to deduce that it had immense importance for the people of this region, and its symbolism is proof of this. Seahenge gave scholars and scientists some crucial insights into the life of Bronze Age people that inhabited early Britain. Thanks to the degree of preservation of the trunks, a lot has been learned through testing. The trunks still display visible marks of hewing and narrowing down to a point. Like when you chop it off and it comes a point to it, used to drive things into the ground and so on, right? You'd have to do that. You make it look like an arrow, and point it and drive it into the ground. What did the other end of them look like? They aren't too sure. Some tales say that they were real tall, though, and then they're all connected in, so you can imagine it being a totally enclosed thing with one vent gap in it, and that vent gap had another tree right out just slightly in front of that, allowing an entrance. And what's in the middle of this? A stump turned upside down the other way, and I bet there's a lot of birds up around the ring on top of this thing. Seahenge gave scholars insight into this situation, and thanks to this degree of preservation that they have, we're able to still look at it and research it. But there's a problem with that. We'll get to that just shortly. Research show that this was done with between 30 and 40 bronze axes, all of which came from the region of Cornwall, which we know is the ancient hookup for tin in the Bronze Age. But she says it's clear that the ancient inhabitants of modern Norfolk most certainly engaged in trade with their neighboring tribes, and they had traveled quite a distance to acquire their bronze tools, like the Phoenicians and other bronze things. And they bring copper, and they bring a shitload of copper if you'll give them some of that tin, because it doesn't take that much of that tin, but we really need that tin. How much? About 10%, a little less, works just fine. So here we see a ancient bronze axe that was found with this, and you look at it and you can see it's a little thicker in the middle and got those ribbings that are onto it. In the very back left part of it, it is a pick type situation, and then on the other side it's definitely a hewing axe. We familiar? If this was smaller, you would say it's a hatchet or a tomahawk. These devices go extremely back into the Stone Age when they're doing this with stones. But here we go. And so it's a multi-purpose tool. Most people go right past that. Of course, in our modern technologies, they try to feign off of it. But look, you can dig and farm and do things and chop down trees all with this utensil that's going on here. And if you want to get to war, there's a problem. Here we go. That's a damn good weapon. At the same breath, though, you would see ones that are made for chopping down trees a lot of times and exclusively for it, and not farming and things like that, and the other uses for the other end, as a blade like the one on the right, on the left, and be a double-headed war axe, as we know of them, and so on, and you see so often in things. But, well, why would they do that? Well, hey, check it out. Here's the idea. When they're hewing down trees, it'll eventually get dulled out a little bit, and so you can sharpen both ends of it at night by fire and doing the thing like Cronan and all that. And then the next day when you start out, you can at least work through a couple of trees here, maybe with these other buddies knocking the hell out of it, and get them taken care of because you've got a double blade on it. I could go off into axes and weapons and all kinds of stuff about this, but let's just continue. Maybe I'll have something else to add to it in a second. 4,000-year-old bronze axe head found in Sweden to show that axes were used for the construction of Seahenge could have looked like, the Swedish History Museum. So that one's found up in Sweden, but they found, well, two of them right there where this guy was at. A less credible and less logical theory is that the workforce was in fact from Cornwall. Other research helped scientists to pinpoint the exact period of the construction when the trees felled, to the late spring or early summer of 2049 BC, all on the same day, they say, and I don't think you can get that to it, but they can sure say that it was all during that season. Over a process of a few weeks, and then they decided to do this big thing, and they did it. This tells us that it was an important, planned event that had involved a lot of people, perhaps as much as 50. Well, how about 200? How about the whole community of much more than 10,000? Yeah, well, how much involvement was there? Well, there was guys that could go out and grab the trees and nab them in a couple of days. They've got them all felled down and bringing worked, done things. And then they got to split them all, do all these things, create a workshop. All that. Yeah, amazing endeavor. And then they're going to pile drive them right next to each other around in a circle, flat on the inside like you do an ancient log cabin. You know, how far do log cabins go back? Well, it's not from Lincoln's time and Lincoln logs. It's far older. Yeah. This is another important insight into society of the past. It suggests that strong communities did exist around this time, and large-scale constructions were very familiar to them. When it comes to the surroundings of Seahenge, details were much scarcer. In 2049, the area looked slightly different, and the henge was situated on a salt marsh, also known as a tidal marsh. At this time, as time progressed and water came up higher, it became a freshwater wetland, and this ecosystem allowed the growth of trees. As these decayed over centuries, they became a layer of peat that covered the flats, and we know how that protects and preserves things. As the time rolled onward, so did the sea, and the peat layers were covered by sand and salt water, which preserved the remains along with the peat, and we can thus deduce that originally it was built deeper inland, but that the area became current beach over the millennia. Although little excavations could be made in the vicinity of Seahenge, because it's out of the water, they yielded some interesting finds. Archaeologists could not find any material from the earliest periods of the henge's use, but finds of mid to late Bronze Age pottery shards tell us that the site saw a period of prominent use several centuries after it was even constructed. Yeah, well, we've talked before in a couple of different videos about this sacred pottery breaking and things that went on in cultures, and you can see that they're hundreds of years later still have this ideology and going on with it. In fact, people today who are really even still somewhat unsure of Stonehenge still want to go see it and the revelry of it, or the pyramids. are one of 100,000 places that have been found, from Lascaux cave paintings all the way to something much more modern like Greece and Rome. Destruction or preservation, a conflict emerges. Here's where I was talking about where it caused a little problem. When Seahenge was officially discovered in 1998, although it was a majestic find, it was still a little controversial, which led to a conflict between several involved parties shortly after initial find. Seahenge itself was only named after 1998 and had no name before that given, although it was already somewhat known to the locals who knew of its existence for some time. And when scientists and archaeologists began their proper excavation, several voices rose in opposition. They were like, this is something that's sacred, just like Stonehenge, and yeah, don't mess with it. Someone can understand that point. This is this is a view of it here, several months after discovery, by which time archaeologists had already removed that log over there and some chunks and taken a chunk out of the central altar, which comprised of the inverted tree trunk of the giant elder oak tree. First, there were locals. They desired to retain the remnants of the wooden circle and display it locally in hopes of attracting tourists to their region by having a piece of heritage for their village. I mean, you could build a retaining wall around it and something, and put pumps in there that go. And hey, if you want to be all green, you could even over here on the shore, way back over here, through cabling. Which, if you want to dig it under the ground, you can, and have it solar powered or wind powered. They got a lot of wind going on here. Throw a little wind station near there, and that helps the whole city. But no one wants to do something like that to their beach, and especially something like that. But if you want to protect it and make a local museum or something. Well, they didn't have that. But hey, there's hopes. Then there were the modern Druids and neo-pagans. They gave adamant opposition to even the disturbance of the remains and wanted them to remain in situ, untouched, to avoid sacrilege and just leave it alone. Someone could understand that point of view too. So people started coming out here and showing up and stuff a whole lot, like you see here. Protesters considered dismantling of Seahenge to be a desecration to anchored sacred site, mounted a guard to prevent further damage to the site by archaeologists. So there became a problem with that, and eventually there in stepped the law, and the situation is like, you're not going to injure these people while they come out and try to do their work. In time, they launched a proper publicity campaign against the scientists who wanted to remove the remnants and take them for preservation and display in a museum. Eventually, the research team managed to acquire a high court injunction which prevented several of the key protesters from even approaching the site. The media soon picked up on the discovery and conflict, and soon the news spread. The wooden circle was soon to be dubbed the Stonehenge of the Sea, or Stonehenge beneath the sea, or Stonehenge's underwater sister. As a result, it eventually received its name of Seahenge, although it's mostly not exactly a hinge. Well, no, it's not for a calendar of the years and all the things and the lineups and so on. It's more of a death ritual type deal, and while once a year at least, if not both periods crossing from each other, there would have been ceremonies that go there, just like ceremonies that they went in Stonehenge and so on during certain times of year we just talked about, and Halloween, Samhain, and Beltane, and all the other types of things that could go on. And so it had to do with that more than anything. But I would wonder where that line up with heading into it. Is it just a convenient point, or was it exactly lined up toward the solstice point? Air Stonehenge. Wildlife protection also entered the fray with their own complaints, claiming that increasing visitors to the site, some 5,000 of them even in the first year after discovery, disturbed the wildlife of the area, and particularly wader birds and things, and it was causing a problem. So if they wanted to do something about it, they're going to have to make a little place for it or do something, and people to go, and then not to be just wandering up and down the beach. Oh, you found this? I'm going to go down this way. And they're just hordes of them running up and down the beach. And the locals were, instead of the locals embracing that and trying to corral it away from a situation like this, it just became a situation everybody wanted to see. I'm not hurting anything. Well, no, you're not, but hundreds of you are, thousands of you definitely are, and here we go. The area was part of Home Dunes National Nature Preserve, luckily. The publicity reached all of its time high in 1999, a year later, when the famous Channel 4 historical show called Time Team ran a special documentary episode on Seahenge and the legal battle over its excavation. Seeing these people, they even took strollers out here and they left it there, and you can see they all took off their shoes. Let me get this out of the way. There's a bunch of shoes over under that too. So a lot of them took off their shoes to walk out on it, so they wouldn't even disturb it like that. No, it still wasn't good enough necessarily. Should just leave it alone. Well, you didn't even know it was here, but now that we do, I can see a bunch of cross points. Tell me what you think down in the comments. But in the end, the English Heritage Team of Excavations had the last word and completely removed Seahenge from its original position, albeit under the watchful gaze of many of gathered protesters, the media, and police force. At the climax point of the excavation, when the majestic tree stump was being pulled out, a distressed young female protester named Karen dashed through the protective circle and the police force in an attempt to stop the excavation. In the end, she was subdued and removed from the site. What happened to Seahenge? Well, the remains of Seahenge are transported to a field centre of the Finland Archaeological Trust at Flag Fen in Cambridgeshire. There, they were preserved by immersion in a fresh water and underwent thorough cleansing, scanning, processing, and further conservation. A very interesting and unique method of preserving them was employed in particular. The remains were continually soaked over the years in wax emulsified water. This resulted in the moisture that was gathered in the wood over the centuries to be replaced with wax. In the end, the entire remnants of Seahenge were successfully preserved for posterity and stored. A replica was put on display in King's Lynn Museum in King's Lynn, 2008. So they took it and stored it and everything, and they've got it, but nobody's even really looking at it. I mean, somebody would say, well, if you're going to do it for the museum, then you should have used it instead of doing a replica of it. Well, it's better if we do the replica of it. Do you want us to do something about how it used to look, or like if I took the stump and set it out here right now, or what? There's that problem too. But then again, why'd you even take it out of the ground? Well, I have to study it. It's a big, complicated mess, isn't it? A link to connect the ages. Stonehenge is not the only discovery of its type in England, by far. Just 100 meters to the east of Stonehenge is another double wood circle that was discovered, albeit smaller and less preserved, but it's a clear indication that these wood enclosures were a very important ritual tradition for Bronze Age Britain natives, especially in East Anglia of the Angles. Sites like these are a true treasure of archaeology and some of the most important links to the Bronze Age cultures of Europe. They show us the image of a past long gone, of lives that were deeply in tune with the world around them, and who believe in things deeper and more mysterious than we perhaps dare then to realize. At a time no longer threatens their survival, they are now immortal. Well, yeah, once we find these sites, we connect it and you can do something like that, only there's really nothing for the locals to look at, as if there was a giant thing to look at before. I mean, could you build something that replicates it right where it was now and let it go through the whole 2,000, 4,000 year process again? Have some people find some trees that they wanted to, if they fit, it takes 26 of them in a stump, split them in half. Is that cool, or is that desecrating the ground? Or if you built it over here behind us, over here on the left, so it's not out in the marsh, and you just put this little barrier around where it used to be, and way back here you put a plaque talking about it, and you say, don't mess with it and the birds, and you show the real site that's up here, or would that be too much and everybody still would be walking out and going, well, where was it? And do this. Should they build a sidewalky type thing that you don't get off, that goes out there and has a little look onto it? And that's all? So shorebirds could be right over there and right over there and there's no real problem? Could they start a vending machine right here? Then for a quarter it'll give you a handful of bird food, and then you throw it around and now you've got too many shorebirds. Or should we do any of that? Let me know down in the comments. But hopefully this will give you some insight into what I feel and have found over the years that's not really mentioned in the story here, and how it was used for ancient burials of certain people, not necessarily all. But there were places like this found too where all were taken from the locals, like this, and allowed to go through the same type of process. Certain other cultures had cremation and other forms of burial that we found too. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy, y'all. Peace.